What happens when a man who's lost everything, his badge, his reputation, his reason to live, hears his name called out on a desolate Texas road by someone who shouldn't even know he exists? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and let's discover together how sometimes our darkest moments lead us to the light we never knew we needed. The dust kicked up by my boots had been my only companion for 3 weeks now, ever since I'd ridden out of Millfield with nothing but the clothes on my back and the bitter taste of betrayal still burning my throat. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the empty road, stretching toward nowhere in particular, and I figured that was fitting enough for a man like me, Ezekiel Bramwell, former sheriff, current nobody. The star that once gleamed on my chest now lay buried somewhere in the desert behind me, along with whatever fool notion I'd once held about justice and doing right by folks. Cornelius Blackthorne had seen to that, painting me as crooked as a dog's hind leg when all I'd done was refuse to look the other way while he squeezed every last penny from the hard-working people of our town. My horse had given out 2 days back, poor beast. I'd sold my saddle and bridle to a passing trader for enough coin to see the animal got proper care, leaving me to continue this journey on foot. Seemed appropriate somehow. A man who'd failed at everything else might as well fail at having decent transportation too. The road ahead shimmered in the heat, creating those dancing mirages that make a man think he's seeing things that ain't there. Water where there's none. Towns where there's only emptiness. Hope where there's nothing but more miles of hard-packed earth and scorching sun. I'd been following this particular stretch for the better part of the morning, heading toward what I hoped might be the settlement of Cedar Ridge, though I wasn't entirely certain I was even on the right path anymore. That's when I heard it, clear as church bells on a Sunday morning, cutting through the silence like a knife through butter. Ezekiel Bramwell. I stopped dead in my tracks, the hair on the back of my neck standing up like I'd been struck by lightning. Nobody knew my name out here. Nobody should even know I existed, let alone where to find me on this god-forsaken stretch of road. I turned around slowly, my hand instinctively moving toward where my gun should have been, only to remember I'd sold that too, along with the holster, to pay for a hot meal back in Dry Creek. Behind me, maybe 30 yards back, stood a figure I swear hadn't been there moments before. A woman, by the look of it, wearing a simple brown dress that had seen better days and a worn bonnet that cast shadows across her face. She stood perfectly still, like she was waiting for something, or maybe gathering the courage to say whatever had brought her to call out my name. "Ma'am," I called back, my voice rougher than I'd intended, "I believe you've got me at a disadvantage." She took a step forward, then another, and I could see she was young, maybe 20 or so, with the kind of pale complexion that spoke of recent hardship. Her dress was travel-worn and dusty, and there was something about the way she held herself that reminded me of a spooked horse, ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. "You are Sheriff Bramwell, aren't you?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between us. "From Millfield?" "Former sheriff," I corrected, surprised by the bitter edge that crept into my tone. "And I'm wondering how a young lady like yourself comes to know that name, especially out here in the middle of nowhere." She walked closer, and I could see her face more clearly now. Pretty in a delicate sort of way, with large brown eyes that held more worry than any person her age should have to carry. But it was the desperate hope in those eyes that caught me off guard. Like she was looking at me as if I might actually be able to help her with something. "My name is Temperance Ashford," she said, stopping about 10 feet away from me. "Man, I've been looking for you, Sheriff Bramwell. Looking for 3 weeks now, ever since—" She paused, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the empty road behind her. "Ever since I heard what really happened in Millfield." My blood ran cold. "What you heard?" "Ma'am, I'm not sure what stories might be making their way around that you stood up to Cornelius Blackthorne," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "That you wouldn't take his money to look the other way while he destroyed innocent families. That you lost everything because you chose to do what was right instead of what was profitable." I stared at her, feeling like I'd been gut-punched. "Miss Ashford, I don't know who's been filling your head with such notions, but my father," she said simply. Before he died, before they killed him for standing up to the same man who destroyed you. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd heard rumors, whispers about people who'd crossed Blackthorn and ended up dead or disappeared, but I'd never had proof. Never had someone stand before me and speak it plain as day. Your father, I repeated slowly. He stood up to Blackthorn. Thomas Ashford. He owned a small ranch outside Millfield until Blackthorn decided he wanted the land for his railroad expansion. When Papa refused to sell, they started with threats. Then they poisoned our cattle. When Papa still wouldn't budge, they... Her voice broke and she took a shaky breath. They made it look like an accident, a fall from his horse, but I saw the rope marks on his neck. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Miss Ashford, these are serious accusations you're making. I know what I saw, she said fiercely, and I know you're the only man who ever stood up to Cornelius Blackthorn and lived to tell about it. That's why I need your help. My help? I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about any of this. Miss, I'm not sure what you think I can do. I'm not sheriff anymore. I'm not anything anymore. I'm just a man walking down a road with nothing to his name and nowhere to go. But you're alive, she said, stepping closer, and you know what kind of man Blackthorn really is. That makes you the only person who might be willing to help me stop him. Stop him from what? She looked over her shoulder again, and I saw real fear in her eyes. From selling me to settle my father's supposed debts. He's claiming Papa owed him money for the cattle feed that was poisoned, and now he says I'm responsible for the debt. Tomorrow morning, he's planning to auction me off to whoever's willing to pay the highest price. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I'd heard of such things happening in the darker corners of the frontier, where law was scarce and powerful men made their own rules, but to hear it spoken so plainly, by someone standing right in front of me. An auction, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, to men who don't particularly care whether a woman's willing or not, she said, her chin lifting with a courage that amazed me. Men who see women as property to be bought and used. I ran away 3 days ago, but his men are hunting me. I can't keep running forever, and I can't face what's waiting for me if they catch me. I stood there looking at this brave young woman who'd somehow tracked me down on an empty road in the middle of Texas, who'd pinned her hopes on a disgraced former lawman who couldn't even afford to keep his own horse. The smart thing would be to wish her luck and keep walking. The safe thing would be to tell her I couldn't help her and continue on my way to nowhere. But looking into those desperate, hopeful eyes, I found myself thinking about the oath I'd taken when I first pinned on that sheriff's star, to protect and serve, to stand between the innocent and those who would do them harm. That star might be buried in the desert behind me, but maybe the man who'd worn it didn't have to be. Miss Ashford, I said finally, I think you and I need to have ourselves a longer conversation. Chapter 2. We found shelter in an abandoned adobe house about a mile off the main road, its roof half caved in, but its walls still solid enough to provide some protection from both the sun and any curious eyes that might be searching for a runaway young woman. Temperance had managed to keep hold of a small satchel containing some dried meat, hardtack, and a precious water canteen, which she insisted on sharing despite my protests. As we sat in the shade of what had once been someone's kitchen, she told me the rest of her story. Thomas Ashford had indeed been a good man, the kind who believed in hard work and fair dealing. When Blackthorn's men had first approached him about selling his land, he'd politely declined, explaining that the ranch had been in his family for 2 generations and wasn't for sale at any price. That's when the trouble started, Temperance said, staring down at the piece of hardtack in her hands. First, they said our cattle were diseased and had to be destroyed. When Papa protested, they produced a veterinarian who swore the animals were suffering from some illness I'd never heard of. Then they claimed we owed money for special feed that was supposed to cure the sickness, feed that Papa had never ordered and never received. And when he still wouldn't sell, the accident. Her voice went flat, emotionless. Papa was an excellent horseman, Sheriff Bramwell. He'd been riding since he was 4 years old. The idea that he'd simply fall off his horse and break his neck. She shook her head. I found his body at the bottom of Widow's Creek Canyon. His horse was still saddled, grazing peacefully at the top. No way that animal would have wandered back up if Papa had fallen while riding. I'd investigated enough suspicious deaths to know she was probably right. Did you tell anyone what you suspected? Who was I going to tell? Sheriff Morrison? She gave a bitter laugh. He's been in Blackthorn's pocket since the day he took office. When I tried to suggest Papa's death wasn't an accident, he told me grief was making me imagine things, and I should focus on accepting my new circumstances. New circumstances? Being an orphan with debts to pay. Her hands clenched into fists. Suddenly, papers appeared showing that Papa owed Blackthorn nearly $2,000 for various services and supplies. When I couldn't produce that kind of money, Blackthorn graciously offered to forgive the debt in exchange for a 7-year indenture contract. I felt my jaw tighten. Indenture contracts were legal in some territories, but they were little more than slavery with paperwork. You refused, I take it. I told him I'd rather die first. She looked up at me with fierce pride. That's when he informed me that he'd already arranged for my debt to be settled through auction. He said there were several gentlemen who'd expressed interest in acquiring a young woman for various household duties, and that my personal feelings on the matter were irrelevant. How did you manage to escape? They were keeping me locked in the back room of Morrison's office, supposedly for my own protection, while the auction arrangements were finalized. But the lock was old, and I managed to work it loose with a hairpin. I slipped out during the night and started walking. And somehow you knew where to find me? For the first time since we'd started talking, a small smile crossed her face. That's where Providence stepped in, I suppose. 2 days after I ran, I encountered a traveling preacher named Obadiah Fletcher. When I told him my story, he said he'd recently heard about an honest sheriff who'd been driven out of Millfield for refusing to cooperate with Cornelius Blackthorn's schemes. He said you'd been spotted heading south on this very road. Obadiah Fletcher. I remembered him, a circuit preacher who'd passed through Millfield several times, always treating everyone with the same respect, whether they were rich cattlemen or dirt-poor farmers. If he'd vouched for me, that explained how Temperance had known to trust me. Miss Ashford, I said carefully, I want you to understand something. I'm not the man I was when I wore that badge. I've got no authority, no resources, and frankly, no particular reason to believe I can do anything to help you that you can't do for yourself. But you're willing to try. The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a campfire. Was I willing to try? 3 weeks ago, I'd have said no without hesitation. 3 weeks ago, I'd been focused on nothing but getting as far away from Cornelius Blackthorn and his poison as possible. But looking at this young woman who'd risked everything to track down a washed-up former lawman, who'd placed her trust in a man she'd never met based on nothing but stories about his character. I suppose I am, I heard myself saying, though I'm not entirely sure what trying is going to look like. I have an idea about that, she said, her voice gaining excitement. It's dangerous, and it might not work, but it's better than just running until they catch me. I'm listening. We go back to Millfield, but not as fugitives. We go back as husband and wife. I nearly choked on the water I'd been sipping. Come again. Think about it, she said, leaning forward eagerly. Blackthorn's whole scheme depends on me being a helpless orphan with no family to protect her. But if I'm married to a man who knows exactly what Blackthorn is up to, who was there when he tried to corrupt you, who can testify to his methods. Miss Ashford, even if such a plan could work, there's the small matter of us not actually being married. That's where Reverend Fletcher comes in. He's camped about 10 miles south of here, and he's already agreed to perform the ceremony if we can reach him safely. I stared at her. You've already discussed this with him? I told him everything, including my plan to find you. He said if you were half the man people claimed you were, you'd be willing to help a woman in distress, even if it meant personal risk. And if I'm not half the man people claim, then I'll face whatever's coming alone, same as I've been doing. She met my eyes steadily. "But I don't think that's who you are, Ezekiel Bramwell. I think you're exactly the man people say you are, even if you've forgotten it yourself." Before I could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the afternoon air. Temperance went pale, her hand flying to her throat. "They've found me," she whispered. I moved to the window and peered out carefully. 3 riders were approaching the abandoned house, and even from a distance, I could see they weren't the sort of men who made social calls. They were armed, alert, and moving with the purposeful confidence of professional hunters. "Stay down," I told Temperance, my mind racing. We had no weapons, no horses, and no real place to run. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no cover for anyone on foot. If these men meant business, and they certainly looked like they did, we were going to need more than luck to get out of this. "Sheriff Bramwell," one of the riders called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got something that belongs to Mr. Blackthorne. Something that belongs to Blackthorne. Not someone, something." The casual dehumanization in those words made my blood boil in a way I hadn't felt since I'd lost my badge. "Come out peaceful-like," the voice continued, "and maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement." I looked at Temperance, who was pressed against the wall beside the window, her face white but her jaw set with determination. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let these men take her back to face Blackthorne's auction block. "Miss Ashford," I said quietly, "I believe it's time we discuss the details of your plan." Dilna. Iku. Chapter 3. The 3 men were spreading out around the house, professional-like, when I made my decision. I'd spent enough years wearing a badge to recognize the type. Hired guns who'd do whatever they were paid to do without asking too many questions about right and wrong. "Temperance," I said, keeping my voice low, "there's a back door to this place, isn't there?" She nodded, pointing toward what had once been the rear of the house. "But it leads straight into open desert. They'll see us the moment we step outside." "Maybe, but staying here isn't an option." I moved toward the back door, studying the landscape beyond. About 100 yards out, there's a dry creek bed. If we can reach it without being spotted, we can follow it south toward where you said Reverend Fletcher is camped. And if we can't reach it, I looked at her seriously, then we'll face whatever comes next together. But I'm not letting them take you back to Blackthorne, Miss Ashford. Not while there's breath in my body. Something changed in her expression at those words, a softening, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. "Ezekiel," she said softly, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm grateful you didn't just keep walking when I called your name." "Temperance," I replied, surprised by how natural her first name felt on my tongue. "I think meeting you might be the first good thing that's happened to me in a very long time." Before either of us could say more, the voice from outside called again, closer now. "We're losing patience out here. Come out now or we're coming in." I took Temperance's hand, noting how small and cold it felt in mine, and led her toward the back door. On my signal, we run for that creek bed like our lives depend on it, because they probably do. She squeezed my hand once, firmly, and I felt something pass between us, an understanding, a commitment, maybe even the beginning of something deeper. Then I eased the door open and peered out. The coast looked clear, but I knew that could change in a heartbeat. "Now," I whispered, and we broke from the house at a dead run. We'd covered maybe 50 yards when the shouting started behind us. "There! They're heading for the creek!" Gunshots cracked across the desert air, but we kept running, Temperance's skirts billowing as she matched my pace step for step. The woman could run. I'd give her that. We reached the creek bed just as more shots echoed behind us, and I pulled her down into the shallow depression just in time to hear a bullet whine overhead. "This way," I gasped, pointing south along the meandering path of the dry creek. "Stay low and keep moving. Keep." We half ran, half crawled along the creek bed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind us. Finally, when my lungs felt like they might burst, I called for a halt. "Do you think we lost them?" Temperance whispered, her face flushed from exertion, but her eyes bright with determination. "For now, maybe. But they'll keep looking, and they know this country better than we do." I wiped sweat from my forehead, thinking hard. "How far did you say it was to Reverend Fletcher's camp?" "Maybe 6 miles south of here, near a place called Angel Springs." 6 miles. In the desert heat, with no water except what little remained in Temperance's canteen, and with armed men hunting us. It wasn't going to be easy, but I'd faced worse odds before. "All right then," I said, getting to my feet and offering her my hand. "Let's go find ourselves a preacher." We made good time following the creek bed, which twisted and turned through the desert landscape like a brown snake. As we walked, Temperance told me more about her plan, how she'd explained everything to Reverend Fletcher, how he'd agreed that a marriage might provide the legal protection she needed, and how he'd promised to help in any way he could. "He said something else too," she added, glancing at me sideways. "He said that sometimes God puts people in each other's path, not just to solve immediate problems, but because they're meant to face life's challenges together." He sounds like a wise man. He is. But Ezekiel, I want you to understand, if we do this, if we actually get married, I won't expect it to be anything more than a legal arrangement. I know you didn't ask for any of this, and I won't hold you to promises made under duress. I stopped walking and turned to face her. "Temperance, can I ask you something?" "Of course. In all the stories you heard about me, all the reasons you decided to track me down, was there anything about me being the kind of man who makes promises he doesn't intend to keep?" She studied my face carefully. "No. Everything I heard suggested you were a man of your word. Then you should know that if I stand before Reverend Fletcher and make vows to you, I'll mean every one of them. Not because of the circumstances that brought us together, but because—" I paused, surprised by what I was about to say. "Because in the last few hours, I've remembered what it feels like to have something worth fighting for." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she reached up and touched my cheek gently. "Do you really mean that?" "Every word." "Then I think we'd better find that preacher." We reached Angel Springs just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Reverend Fletcher's camp was exactly where Temperance had said it would be. A small tent pitched near the natural spring, with a modest campfire and a hobbled mule grazing nearby. Obadiah Fletcher himself was a tall, spare man, with kind eyes and hands that spoke of years spent doing honest work. When he saw us approaching, he rose from his seat by the fire with a welcoming smile. "Miss Ashford," he said warmly, "I was beginning to worry about you. And this must be Sheriff Bramwell." "Former sheriff," I corrected automatically. "In God's eyes, a man who stands up for what's right never stops being who he's called to be," Fletcher replied. "Miss Ashford has told me your story, and I want you to know that I consider it an honor to meet you." "Reverend," Temperance said urgently, "we need to ask you to perform that ceremony we discussed. Blackthorn's men found us, and they're still hunting. We need to get back to Millfield as soon as possible." Fletcher nodded gravely. "I understand. But before we proceed, I need to ask you both a question. Are you entering into this marriage solely as a means of protection, or is there something deeper here?" Temperance and I looked at each other. "I think," I said slowly, "there might be something deeper. Something that started the moment she called my name on that empty road. And you, Miss Ashford, I sought out a protector," she said, her voice steady, "but I found something I wasn't looking for. A good man who reminds me what courage looks like." Fletcher smiled. "Then let's begin." The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted by firelight under a canopy of desert stars. When Fletcher pronounced us husband and wife, and I kissed Temperance for the first time, I felt something inside me that had been broken begin to heal. The next morning, we rode back toward Millfield. Fletcher had insisted on lending us his mule and accompanying us as a witness to our marriage. As we crested the hill overlooking the town, I saw Cornelius Blackthorn's empire spread out below us like a cancer on the landscape. "Ready for this?" I asked Temperance. "With you beside me, I'm ready for anything." We rode into Millfield as the sun reached its peak, husband and wife, prepared to face whatever Blackthorn could throw at us. But this time, I wasn't facing him alone, and neither was she. We had each other, we had the truth, and sometimes in a place where justice was scarce, that was enough to change everything. As we dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, I saw Blackthorn himself emerge from the building, his face dark with rage. But for the first time since I'd lost my badge, I felt ready for whatever came next. "Hello, Cornelius," I said calmly. "I'd like you to meet my wife. That's our story. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and unexpected love on the frontier, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more authentic Western stories. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Ezekiel and Temperance's journey. And don't forget to hit that like button if you want to see more stories like this one. Until next time, may your trails be clear and your companions true.